The message came in after midnight. Not a press release, not a briefing, not even a leak, at least not yet. It was a quiet alert. The kind that doesn't ping phones loudly but changes posture instantly. The kind that makes aides stop mid-sentence. The kind that makes security stand a little straighter, even though no one has raised their voice. Here's the question you need to sit with right now. What discovery is serious enough that the King of the United Kingdom and the future king would move together in silence and strip royal privileges without warning? Because that's what happened. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And no, this wasn't gradual. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't symbolic. It was fast, surgical. And according to multiple palace insiders, it happened after something surfaced that was never meant to be seen outside a very small circle. Let's rewind. Picture the hour. London is quiet. Most of the country is asleep. No cameras. No crowds. No applause. Just corridors, lights dimmed low, and people who've served the crown for decades realizing they're about to witness a line being crossed that rarely is. You're probably asking yourself, haven't we seen royal drama before? Yes, we have. But this feels different. Because this time, the reaction came first, and the explanation didn't come at all. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't just the removal of privileges. It's the fact that it happened before the public even knew there was a problem, before commentators could speculate, before allies could prepare statements, before critics could sharpen their knives. That's not how the monarchy usually works. The modern royal system is built on pacing, delay, soft landings, time to frame the narrative, time to test public reaction, time to let controversy cool before action is taken. None of that happened here. Instead, something was discovered late at night, assessed quickly, and deemed so serious that both King Charles III and Prince William agreed on one thing immediately. Act now. Explain later. And that alone should stop you in your tracks. Because if you understand anything about the relationship between Charles and William, it's this. They do not rush consensus. They approach crises differently. Charles is known for deliberation, historical weight, and caution. William is known for decisiveness, optics, and future-proofing. When those two instincts align instantly, it's not because of convenience. It's because of necessity. So what was found? Before we go there, we need to understand why the concept of royal privileges matters more than titles, more than headlines, and sometimes even more than public favor. Royal privileges are not always written down. They exist in access, in security clearance, in who receives briefings and who doesn't, in which residences remain available, in which invitations still arrive, in which doors open automatically, and which suddenly don't. Stripping a privilege isn't like removing a badge. It's more like quietly disconnecting someone from the system. No announcement required. No explanation owed. Just absence. And the night this happened, absence became the message. According to sources familiar with palace protocol, the discovery was not a rumor, not gossip, not speculation pulled from the media. It was something tangible, something verifiable, something that forced immediate recalculation. Think about that. The monarchy tolerates embarrassment. It survives scandal. It even weathers contradiction. But it does not tolerate risk, especially not risk that threatens the institution itself. That's where this story really begins. Not with the public reaction, because there wasn't one yet. Not with headlines, because they came later. But with a moment when senior figures realized that what they believed was contained wasn't. Now ask yourself this. Why late night? Why not wait until morning? Why not convene a broader advisory group? Why not allow time for legal buffers and PR frameworks? Because waiting would have made it worse. Because delay would have implied tolerance. Because by sunrise, the situation could have escalated beyond control. And that's the part most people are missing. This wasn't about punishment. It was about containment. Inside the palace, the language used wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Words like exposure, precedent, and liability reportedly came up more than once. That should tell you something. When institutions act coldly, it's often because the consequences of emotion are too expensive. Now let's talk about why this matters to you. Even if you don't follow royal news closely, the British monarchy survives on trust. Not just public trust, but internal trust. Advisors trust that information flows upward. Family members trust that boundaries are respected. Security trusts that access is not abused. Once that trust fractures, privilege becomes a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities are removed quietly. Which brings us back to that night. Phones rang. Not many. Just enough. Aides were summoned. Not all. Only those who needed to know. And somewhere in that process, a decision was made that crossed an invisible line. One that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Here's another question. If this was minor, why has there been no detailed denial? Why hasn't the palace clarified the scope of what was removed? Why hasn't anyone stepped forward to say, this isn't what it looks like? Silence, in royal terms, is never accidental. It's strategy, and silence usually means one of two things. Either the truth is too complex to explain, or too damaging to clarify. Now consider this. Privileges can be reinstated, but rarely are, because once removed, they signal something deeper. A judgment has already been made. Not publicly, not legally, but institutionally. And institutions, remember, this is where the emotional weight of the story begins to surface. Because stripping privileges isn't just administrative, it's relational. It says, you are no longer inside the circle of implicit trust. You might still exist publicly. You might still speak, but you no longer represent us. And that decision, made jointly by Charles and William, suggests something else entirely. This wasn't about the past. It was about the future. William's involvement is critical here, not because he holds the power now, but because he represents where that power is going. Anything he signs on to is a signal that this decision isn't temporary. It's directional. So when people ask, why now? The better question is, how long was this coming? Because insiders suggest this discovery didn't come out of nowhere. It confirmed something that had raised quiet concerns before, something that had been flagged, minimized, and set aside, until it couldn't be anymore. That's often how institutional crises unfold, not with explosions, with confirmations. And once confirmed, the response is swift. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of all. One of the privileges removed that night wasn't public-facing at all. No one outside the palace would immediately notice it, but those inside did. And when they did, the message was clear. This isn't a warning. It's a boundary. And boundaries, once enforced at this level, don't come with second chances. So now you're probably thinking, what exactly was discovered? Was it documentation? Communication? A pattern of behavior? Something involving access that should never have been used? The palace isn't saying. And that might be the loudest answer of all. Because the monarchy doesn't move this decisively unless it believes the cost of transparency outweighs the cost of speculation. Which means what came next, what followed this silent midnight decision, wasn't just fallout. It was a chain reaction. And in the next section, we're going to step into the moment that triggered it all. The alert, the confirmation, and the realization that forced 2 generations of royal leadership to act as one. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous moments don't announce themselves with alarms, but with confirmation? That's the question hanging in the air as we step directly into what happened next. Because after the quiet alert, after the late-night realization that something wasn't just wrong but verified, the palace didn't erupt into chaos. It went still. That's how people who've worked inside describe it. Not panic, not shouting. Stillness. The kind of stillness that only comes when a system understands it's about to protect itself. Within minutes, the alert was no longer a single message. It became a chain, carefully controlled, precisely routed. No mass notifications. No unnecessary names added. Only those whose roles required immediate awareness were looped in. And here's the first thing that should make you pause. This wasn't treated as a scandal. It was treated as an exposure. There's a massive difference between the two. Scandals are managed with optics. Exposure is managed with containment. One of the first calls, according to insiders, wasn't to communications. It wasn't to public relations. It wasn't even to senior courtiers whose job is usually to soften impact. It was to verify, because whatever had surfaced had to be real, undeniable, documented, cross-checked. And that verification didn't take long, which tells you something else. This wasn't speculative material pulled from rumor or media chatter. This was something concrete enough that once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Now let me ask you something directly. How often do you think the monarchy moves fast? Not ceremonially fast, Not statement released fast, but structurally fast. Almost never. Speed is not a royal instinct. Longevity is. So when speed overrides tradition, it means the clock has already run out. Inside those walls, the confirmation landed like weight, not shock. As if the palace wasn't surprised by the nature of what was discovered, only by the timing of its arrival. That's important, because it suggests this discovery didn't create suspicion. It validated it. At that point, the question wasn't, is this real? It was, how far does this go? And that question carries consequences. Because once you confirm something sensitive inside a hierarchical institution, you don't just ask what it is. You ask who knew, who should have known, and who benefited from not knowing. That's when privilege becomes dangerous. Royal privilege isn't just ceremonial advantage. It's access. It's proximity. It's credibility borrowed from the crown itself. And if privilege is attached to something that now poses risk, it stops being a reward and starts being a liability. So the next step was inevitable. Contain the exposure. But containment at this level doesn't look like closing a door. It looks like disconnecting pathways. Let's slow this down for a moment. When we say strip royal privileges, most people imagine public acts, titles removed, patronages revoked, security details changed. Those things matter, but they're not always first. The first privileges removed are invisible. Access to briefings, automatic inclusion in sensitive correspondence. The assumption of trust. That's where it starts. And that's exactly where it did start that night. One senior aide reportedly asked a simple question during those early hours. What do we stop immediately? Not what do we announce? Not how do we explain? Stop. And the answer came back, just as simply. Everything that assumes trust. Think about how chilling that is. Trust wasn't suspended. It was withdrawn, which means someone crossed a threshold that can't be uncrossed quietly. Now let's talk about who was involved in that decision. Because this wasn't delegated. It went straight to the top. King Charles III was briefed first. Not with speculation. With verification. He didn't need persuasion. He needed confirmation. And once he had it, the next call wasn't ceremonial. It was to Prince William. That alone breaks with tradition. William is often consulted, yes. But he is not always pulled into immediate crisis response unless the implications stretch well beyond the present reign. This did. And whatever was shared with him closed the gap between generations instantly. There was no pushback. No, let's wait. No, how will this look? Just agreement. That's how insiders knew this was different. Because William's role in moments like this isn't about authority, it's about direction. If he signs on, it means the future monarchy cannot afford to inherit this problem unresolved. So ask yourself this. What kind of discovery forces a reigning monarch and his heir to act not for today, but to protect tomorrow? It's not embarrassment. It's not reputation. It's not even popularity. It's institutional risk. And institutional risk triggers a specific kind of response. Quiet, decisive, irreversible. Now, let's address the contradiction that makes this story so powerful. If this discovery was so serious, why wasn't the public told immediately? Because the monarchy does not operate on transparency first. It operates on stability first. Public disclosure comes only after internal exposure has been neutralized. Otherwise, you risk compounding damage. So instead of explanation, the palace chose subtraction. Privileges removed. Access narrowed. Silence maintained. That's not avoidance. That's control. And the thing about control is this. It often reveals itself in absence rather than action. Certain invitations stopped arriving. Certain communications no longer included familiar names. Certain automatic courtesies quietly ended. To outsiders, nothing looked different. To insiders, everything did. This is where emotional beats start to surface. Because privilege isn't just power. It's identity. When someone inside the royal ecosystem loses it, they don't just lose access. They lose position, meaning, relevance. And according to people who witnessed the aftermath, the reaction to that sudden absence was not calm. There was confusion, then frustration, then realization. And realization is the most dangerous stage. Because that's when people start asking questions. Why me? Why now? Who decided this? But by then, the decision was already sealed. That's another key detail. This wasn't put to committee. It wasn't delayed pending review. It wasn't softened with conditions. It was done. And once done, It set something else in motion, something the palace may have anticipated but could not prevent. Speculation. Because when the monarchy moves without explanation, the vacuum fills itself. And that's where things get messy. Because speculation doesn't just ask what happened. It asks what's coming next. And insiders began to understand something unsettling. This wasn't a one-off. It was a first move, a boundary drawn in response to something discovered, and possibly more that hadn't surfaced yet. That realization changed behavior inside the palace almost immediately. People became cautious, careful with words, selective with information, not out of fear, but awareness. Because when privilege is stripped at this level, it sends a signal to everyone else. No one is untouchable, and that signal reverberates. Now let me put this to you. If you were inside that system, what would you be thinking right now? Who else is at risk? What else might be uncovered? And how much does the palace already know? Those questions don't stay contained. They ripple outward. And as they do, pressure builds, not just externally, but internally. Which brings us to the next critical moment in this story. Because while the palace was busy containing exposure, something else was happening quietly in parallel. Someone realized too late that the privileges they'd taken for granted were already gone. And when they tried to use one of them, just once, they hit a wall they didn't expect. No access, no clearance, no explanation. That moment, that failed assumption, is when the story shifted from quiet containment to inevitable fallout. Because once someone knows they've been cut off, the question becomes simple. What did you find? And what are you going to do with it? In the next section, we're going to move into the exact moment that late-night discovery was confirmed. What it involved, why it couldn't be ignored, and how a single piece of information triggered a response that reshaped royal boundaries overnight. Because once the palace knew for sure, there was no turning back. And what came next would change everything, even faster than the first move. Did you ever notice how the truth doesn't explode all at once? It clicks? That's the sound people inside the palace describe. Not a bang, a click. Because once the verification was complete, once the late-night discovery stopped being a possibility and became a fact, everything shifted from reaction to response. And this is the moment where the story tightens. Because confirmation changes behavior. Up until that point, there was still room, however slim, for interpretation, for alternative explanations, for procedural delay. But confirmation erased that. The discovery wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't something that could be explained away with phrasing or context. It was specific, and it was enough. Here's what matters most about this stage. The palace didn't treat the discovery as isolated. They treated it as connective, meaning the immediate concern wasn't just what had been found, but what it might lead to if left untouched. That's why the next steps weren't emotional. They were architectural. The question guiding the response wasn't who's responsible. It was what systems does this touch? That's how institutions survive crises. They don't chase individuals first. They secure structures. And once that mindset kicked in, the response accelerated. A small group was convened. Not publicly, not ceremonially, and not in the way people imagine royal meetings. This wasn't a long table and formal agendas. This was quiet coordination, trusted aides, legal minds, security advisors. And at the center of it, two figures whose alignment matters more than any headline: King Charles III and Prince William. What's critical here is that neither of them needed convincing. They asked different questions, but arrived at the same conclusion. Charles focused on precedent. William focused on trajectory. Charles asked, what happens if this stays connected to the crown? William asked, what does this become if it isn't stopped now? When both questions point to risk, the answer is always the same. Cut it off. But here's where the contradiction creeps in, and it's important you notice it. While privileges were being stripped swiftly, there was no immediate public distancing. No announcement declaring moral outrage. No dramatic signaling to the press. Why? Because the palace wasn't trying to perform a judgment. It was trying to prevent one. Public condemnation invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites discovery. Discovery invites loss of control. So instead of lighting a beacon, they dimmed the lights. And in doing so, they sent a message only insiders would understand. This connection is no longer safe. Now let's talk about the nature of what was discovered, not in specifics, but in form. Because form tells you more than content ever could. This wasn't hearsay. It wasn't secondhand. It wasn't dependent on interpretation. It existed independently of belief, which means it didn't matter who defended it or denied it. It stood on its. But subtlety only works until someone tests it. And that test came sooner than expected. According to insiders, one attempt to exercise a previously automatic privilege was quietly denied within days of the discovery. No confrontation, no reprimand, just a closed door where an open one used to be. That moment matters more than anything announced publicly, because it's the moment when the person on the receiving end realizes something irreversible has happened. You don't need a statement to understand that. You feel it. And when someone feels it, the next stage begins. Reaction. But reaction doesn't always look like outrage. Sometimes it looks like scrambling. Because once someone knows they've been cut off, they also know they've lost protection. And protection is what keeps things contained. So now ask yourself this. If you suddenly realized the palace had withdrawn trust without warning, what would you assume they knew? And how much time would you think you had? That's the pressure cooker this discovery created. Not just for the individual involved, but for everyone connected to them. Because royal privilege isn't siloed. It radiates, and removing it sends shockwaves. That's why the palace didn't stop with one adjustment. Once the first removal happened cleanly, the framework expanded. Security protocols reviewed. Information channels audited. Assumptions challenged. Not loudly, systematically. And that's when something else surfaced. Not another discovery, but a realization. This situation wasn't isolated to the present moment. It had roots. Quiet ones. Concerns that had been flagged in the past and deprioritized because they didn't cross thresholds. Until now, the late-night discovery didn't introduce a new risk. It confirmed an existing one had matured. That's the part most people don't understand. Institutions don't move this way for surprises. They move this way for confirmations. And confirmation triggers memory. Files reopened. Notes revisited. Patterns reassessed. That's when the palace realized something chilling. This wasn't just about removing privilege. It was about preventing precedent. Because if this behavior, whatever its exact nature, remained connected to the crown, it would signal tolerance. And tolerance becomes endorsement over time. William, in particular, was reportedly firm on this point. Not emotionally. Strategically, the future monarchy cannot afford ambiguity about boundaries, especially not in a media environment that monetizes contradiction. So the line had to be drawn, cleanly, quietly, and early. Which brings us to the most dangerous moment in any institutional response. The gap between action and awareness. Because while the palace was moving with clarity, the outside world was still in the dark. And darkness breeds speculation. Speculation breeds leaks. And leaks are rarely accurate, but always destabilizing. The palace knew this. That's why the next phase of this story wasn't about further removals. It was about readiness. Preparing for the moment when silence would no longer hold. Because silence can delay impact, but it can't erase curiosity. And curiosity was building. Inside the press. Inside political circles. Inside royal households. Questions were forming. Why now? Why so fast? Why together? And those questions were inching closer to answers. In the next section, we're going to examine the first visible crack, the moment when internal containment collided with external curiosity, and the palace had to decide whether to continue saying nothing or prepare for something much bigger. Because once the outside world started asking the right questions, the real countdown began. And the next move would determine whether this story stayed controlled or exploded. What happens when the outside world starts circling a silence? That's the moment we're stepping into now. Because no matter how carefully an institution contains something internally, there is always a tipping point. A point where curiosity shifts from background noise to focused pressure. And once that happens, silence stops being neutral. It starts looking deliberate. Inside the palace, this phase is sometimes described as the narrowing. The number of people who don't know shrinks. The number of people who suspect grows. And somewhere in between, control becomes harder to maintain. That's exactly what began to happen next. It didn't start with headlines. It started with questions. Journalists noticed inconsistencies. Staffers noticed absences. Observers noticed that certain names were no longer appearing where they always had before. No announcement explained it. No correction addressed it. But the pattern was there, faint at first, then undeniable. And here's the key detail most people overlook. The palace didn't panic. It anticipated this. Because internal containment is only half the job. The other half is deciding how much of the truth you're willing to let surface, and when. That's why the next conversations weren't about whether something would come out. They were about what would happen when it did. Inside those conversations, the same two figures remained central. King Charles III viewed the situation through the lens of continuity. Every monarchy survives crises by ensuring they don't define the reign. Prince William viewed it through momentum. Crises are dangerous not when they happen, but when they linger. And here's where their perspectives converged again. Neither wanted this to become a slow bleed. Slow bleeds invite reinterpretation. Reinterpretation invites sympathy. Sympathy invites division. So the goal wasn't to dramatize. It was to conclude, without spectacle. But here's the contradiction. The very act of stripping privileges, even quietly, creates visibility. Absence is noticed, especially in a system built on ritual. So while the palace held its line, something else began to happen. People started filling in the gaps themselves. Whispers appeared in journalistic circles. Background briefings were requested and declined. Former insiders began receiving just checking-in messages. And every declined comment, every non-response, every polite no statement at this time added weight. Because silence doesn't stop speculation. It organizes it. And speculation, once organized, moves fast. Now imagine being on the other side of that silence. Imagine realizing not only that privileges have been removed, but that the institution is preparing for questions you haven't even heard yet. That's when awareness turns into urgency. Because it means the palace isn't just responding to what it knows. It's bracing for what might come next. This is the point where behavior changes. Phones ring more often. Messages go unanswered. Old conversations suddenly feel relevant. And this is where emotional pressure spikes. Because when privilege disappears, so does insulation. Every move becomes personal. Every delay feels intentional. Every closed door feels final. Insiders describe this phase as deeply unsettling. Not because of confrontation, but because of its absence. No arguments. No warnings. No negotiations. Just quiet separation. And separation inside the royal system isn't temporary unless stated otherwise. Which brings us to the first visible fracture. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a leak. It was a question asked publicly that should have had an easy answer, and didn't. A simple query. A routine inquiry. One that previously would have been clarified within hours. This time it wasn't. The delay spoke louder than any denial. And that delay triggered something the palace couldn't fully control. Context building. Once journalists sense something is being withheld, they stop asking what happened and start asking what connects. They look backward. They compare timelines. They re-examine past appearances. They revisit moments that didn't make sense at the time. And here's where things became dangerous. Because the late-night discovery didn't exist in isolation. It fit. It fit into a pattern that, until now, hadn't been compelling enough to pursue. But confirmation gives old details new gravity. And gravity pulls attention. Inside the palace, this shift was felt almost immediately. Briefings became tighter. Language became more careful. Assumptions were dropped. Not because anyone was panicking, but because everyone understood the stakes had escalated. This wasn't just about removing privilege anymore. It was about preserving narrative coherence. Because once multiple interpretations exist, control erodes. And erosion is what the monarchy fears most. So the next strategic decision was subtle but significant. The palace did not rush to counter speculation. It let it breathe. That sounds risky, and it is, but it's also calculated. Letting speculation spread without confirmation allows it to remain fragmented. Different theories compete. None solidify. But this strategy has a weakness. All it takes is one detail to anchor everything. And that detail came closer than expected. Because while the palace was managing external curiosity, someone inside realized something critical. The late-night discovery wasn't the only exposure. It was the one that crossed the threshold, but not the first. That realization reframed everything. Suddenly, the question wasn't just, what do we remove? It was what else is already compromised. And once that question is asked, the scope widens dramatically. This is where institutional memory becomes both asset and threat. Past decisions resurface. Past tolerances are re-examined. Past compromises look different under new light. That's when the palace understood something deeply uncomfortable. If this situation were allowed to linger, it wouldn't just affect one individual. It would invite scrutiny of the system itself. And that is the one thing the monarchy will always avoid. So the strategy evolved again. Instead of explaining the discovery, the palace focused on reinforcing boundaries, reasserting protocol, clarifying internal lines of authority, reaffirming what privilege means and doesn't mean. Not publicly, internally, because internal clarity precedes external stability. But clarity often comes at a cost. And that cost, in this case, was relational. Connection strained, trust tested, assumptions shattered. People who had believed themselves secure realized their position depended entirely on discretion, not loyalty. And discretion, once questioned, is never fully restored. This is where the emotional undercurrent deepens. Because for those affected, this wasn't just political. It was personal. The monarchy doesn't just remove access. It removes belonging. And belonging is everything in a system built on lineage and continuity. Which brings us to the moment when internal containment and external curiosity finally brushed against each other. Not collided, brushed. A leak that wasn't a leak. A comment that wasn't confirmation. A reaction that wasn't denial. Just enough to tell observers they were circling something real. That's when the palace realized the countdown had begun. Not to disclosure, but to inevitability. Because once the right questions are being asked, answers don't stay hidden forever. They surface through pressure, through inference, through consequence. And the palace had to decide what mattered more, control or closure. In the next section, we're going to examine the moment that decision crystallized, the internal debate that determined whether this story would remain a quiet correction or become a defining rupture. Because once that choice was made, the final direction was locked in. And what followed would leave no room for reversal. What if the most important decision wasn't about what to reveal, but about what to end? That was the question hanging over the palace as the countdown reached its most dangerous point. Because by now, silence had done its job. It had slowed the spread. It had blurred the edges. It had kept the story from crystallizing into a single, uncontrollable narrative. But silence has a shelf life. And inside the palace, everyone knew it was expiring. This is the moment where internal debate finally sharpened, not into argument, but into choice. Up until now, the strategy had been containment. Strip privileges, restrict access, reinforce boundaries. Let the outside world guess without confirmation. But a new risk had emerged. Not exposure, interpretation. Because speculation was no longer random. It was converging. Patterns were being noticed. Timelines were being aligned. And once interpretation starts to converge, control weakens fast. That's when the question stopped being, can we keep this quiet? And became, how do we stop this from defining us? This is where things turned. Inside the palace, senior figures began framing the situation in stark terms. If this continued unresolved, it would do three things. First, it would invite sympathy where none was intended. Second, it would fracture internal loyalty by rewarding ambiguity. Third, it would suggest indecision at the very top. None of those outcomes were acceptable. And that's why the next move wasn't reactive. It was conclusive. Here's the part most people don't understand about royal power. It doesn't escalate gradually. It resolves abruptly. And when resolution comes, it's often disguised as routine. That's what happened next. There was no dramatic meeting announced. No extraordinary council summoned. No visible rupture. Instead, a decision already made quietly took shape in final form. Privileges that had been provisionally withdrawn were confirmed as removed. Not temporarily, not pending review, removed. And that confirmation was communicated not with emotion, but with clarity. This status no longer applies. This access is no longer assumed. This association is no longer recognized. No debate, no appeal process, no timeline for reinstatement. That's when everyone inside understood. This wasn't damage control. It was closure. And closure, in royal terms, is brutal in its simplicity. It doesn't explain. It doesn't justify. It moves on. Now let's talk about why this moment mattered so deeply to both generations of leadership. For the king, this was about precedent. Every decision made at this level becomes part of institutional memory. It sets a standard future monarchs inherit, whether they want to or not. Allow ambiguity here, and you invite it later. For the Prince of Wales, this was about trajectory. A future reign cannot begin under the shadow of unresolved compromise. It must draw lines early, even if those lines are uncomfortable. This is where their alignment became decisive. There was no disagreement about optics, no concern about backlash, no hesitation about who might be upset, because the alternative was worse. Allowing this situation to linger would have signaled weakness. And weakness is the one thing the monarchy cannot afford to project, especially in an era where every silence is interrogated. So the choice was made, not to explain, but to end. And ending something at this level sends shockwaves, even when done quietly, because it forces everyone connected to recalibrate. All those who assumed association was permanent, all those who believed proximity equaled protection, all those who thought discretion could always smooth things over. That illusion cracked. Now, here's where the emotional undercurrent becomes impossible to ignore. For the individual on the receiving end of this decision, the realization was devastating. Not because of public humiliation, there wasn't any yet, but because of finality. There was no path back offered, no reassurance whispered behind closed doors. No, we'll see how this plays out. Just distance. And distance, in royal terms, is exile without announcement. This is the stage where reaction turns inward. Shock gives way to anger. Anger gives way to calculation. Because once someone understands they've lost institutional backing, the calculus changes. They're no longer protected by silence. They're exposed to it. And that's when risk multiplies. The palace understood this, which is why the finalization of privilege removal wasn't the end of the response. It was the beginning of readiness. Contingencies were reviewed. Narratives were mapped. Potential disclosures were anticipated. Not because the palace expected retaliation, but because it planned for it. Institutions don't assume goodwill. They assume probability. And the probability here was simple. Someone cut off from privilege may decide they have nothing left to lose. That possibility reshaped everything. So the palace did what it always does in moments like this. It prepared to absorb impact, not by rushing to speak, but by ensuring that if speaking became necessary, it would do so from a position of strength. This is where the story takes a darker turn, because preparation reveals fear, and fear reveals what's truly at stake. Internal reviews expanded. Past communications were reassessed. Connections were scrutinized, not in a frantic way, in a deliberate one. The goal wasn't to uncover new wrongdoing. It was to understand exposure. Where does this touch? Who does this implicate indirectly? What assumptions need revisiting? And the answers to those questions weren't comforting. Because the deeper the review went, the clearer one thing became. This situation wasn't isolated to one action or one moment. It was the result of tolerance. Tolerance that had gone unchallenged until it couldn't anymore. That's the real story here. Not a sudden betrayal. Not a shocking revelation. But a line crossed too many times, quietly, until it finally became visible. And visibility forces action. Now consider the irony. The very discretion that had protected this situation for so long is what ultimately doomed it. Because discretion breeds complacency. And complacency always gets exposed eventually. This is where the emotional tension inside the palace reached its peak. Not because people were afraid of scandal, but because they were confronting regret. Why wasn't this addressed sooner? Why were early warnings minimized? Why did it take a late-night discovery to force clarity? Those questions don't have satisfying answers. And institutions hate unanswered questions. So instead of dwelling on them, the palace did what it does best. It moved forward. And moving forward required one more decision. Whether to let the story emerge organically, or to shape its eventual framing. That decision hadn't been finalized yet. But the groundwork was being laid. Carefully, quietly, without drama. Because once the choice to end had been made, everything else became a matter of timing. And timing, in this case, would determine whether this story faded into controlled correction or erupted into defining crisis. As we move into the next section, we're going to examine the final variable that changed everything. The one factor the palace couldn't fully control, the human response. Because institutions plan, but people react. And once emotions enter the equation, outcomes become unpredictable. In the next chapter, we'll step into the moment when preparation met resistance, and the palace realized that even the quietest decisions can provoke loud consequences. Because what came next wasn't just fallout, it was defiance. And that changed the game entirely. What happens when control meets resistance? That's the question that detonated quietly inside the palace the moment preparation collided with something no institution can fully predict: human reaction. Because until now, the story hovered, unresolved, incomplete, unsatisfying. But unresolved stories don't disappear. They accumulate energy, and energy seeks release. That release came not from the palace, but from perception. A reaction noticed, a comment interpreted, a shift magnified. Nothing definitive, but enough. Enough to suggest that the human response had crossed from private to perceptible. And that's when the palace realized something crucial. This situation could no longer be managed purely internally. The outside world was now participating, even if it didn't yet understand how. That changes everything. Because once perception is involved, timing becomes critical. Wait too long, and the narrative forms without you. Move too fast, and you legitimize speculation. This is the narrowest path an institution can walk, and the palace found itself on it. So the final question emerged, not whether to speak, but when. Because once the palace speaks, even indirectly, it closes one chapter and opens another. And that next chapter would redefine relationships permanently. As we move forward, we're going to examine the moment that timing decision was forced, the incident that accelerated the clock, the trigger that made delay impossible. Because once that happened, the palace no longer had the luxury of patience. And what followed wasn't just clarification. It was consequence. What if the palace didn't lose patience, but ran out of time? That's the shift we're stepping into now. Because the decision wasn't triggered by a headline or a leak. It wasn't forced by outrage or exposure. It was forced by acceleration. Something changed the tempo. And once tempo changes, strategy must follow. Up until this point, the palace had been operating in what insiders call managed quiet. Silence wasn't denial. It was containment. It allowed internal decisions to settle before external noise could harden into narrative. But then came the trigger. Not a confession. Not a document dumped online. Not a formal accusation. Something far more dangerous. Interpretation crossed into assumption. And assumption, once it reaches a certain scale, becomes belief. This is where the palace recognized the shift. The questions being asked externally were no longer curious. They were directional. Journalists weren't asking, "Is something happening?" anymore. They were asking, "What exactly happened?" That distinction matters, because it means the story has moved from discovery to reconstruction. And reconstruction doesn't wait for permission. Inside the palace, this was recognized immediately. The monitoring reports changed tone. The summaries shifted from ongoing speculation to emerging consensus. That's the red flag. Consensus is what locks narratives in place. Once consensus forms, correction becomes exponentially harder. Not impossible, but costly. So the question wasn't whether to intervene. It was how to do so without amplifying what they'd worked so hard to contain. And here's where institutional instinct kicked in. The monarchy doesn't correct rumors directly. It reframes reality indirectly. Instead of saying, "This isn't true," it demonstrates, "This is over." That's what happened next. A sequence of actions, not statements. None of them explosive on their own, but together, unmistakable. Appearances recalibrated. Associations clarified. Protocol tightened visibly. For the first time, what had been internal became perceptible. And that was intentional. Because perception was now part of the battlefield. The palace wasn't trying to explain the discovery. It was trying to show consequence. Now pause here, because this is critical. Consequence is how authority communicates when explanation would weaken it. By allowing observers to see that something had changed, without naming it, the palace anchored interpretation around outcome, not accusation. Something happened. Something ended. Something irreversible occurred. That framing is powerful. It redirects curiosity away from "what did they do?" and toward "why was this allowed to go on as long as it did?" which subtly shifts scrutiny away from the institution and toward circumstance. That's not accidental. That's experience. But even the most experienced institutions can't control every variable, because there was still the human factor. The reaction. Up until now, resistance had been contained privately. Frustration, resentment, calculation, all internal. But the moment consequence became visible, that internal reaction faced a new reality. Silence no longer protected anyone, and that realization can provoke one of two responses: retreat or escalation. The palace prepared for both. What it didn't expect was how quickly the environment would force a choice. Because the trigger wasn't something said, it was something noticed. A change that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Once observers connected that change to the earlier silence, the story snapped into sharper focus. This is where timing collapsed. The palace had intended to move gradually, to let consequence settle without inviting inquiry. But inquiry surged anyway. That forced a recalibration. Internal discussions turned from if to when. When do we let this breathe? When do we allow closure to be perceived? When do we accept that ambiguity has served its purpose? Those are uncomfortable questions, because answering them means acknowledging that silence has reached its limit. Now, here's where the alignment at the top mattered more than ever. King Charles III approached this moment with one priority: preserve institutional dignity. Avoid spectacle. Avoid personalization. Let the system speak. Prince William focused on clarity. Ambiguity breeds doubt. Doubt erodes authority. Authority must be visible, even if it's quiet. Different instincts. Same conclusion. The palace could not allow this story to metastasize into a referendum on its own decisiveness. So the final strategy took shape. Not disclosure. Demonstration. And demonstration is powerful because it doesn't argue. It asserts. This is where observers began to notice something else. Not just what was missing, but what was reaffirmed. The core institution remained intact. The chain of authority was visible. The future direction was signaled clearly. That contrast mattered. It said, whatever this was, it did not destabilize us. And that message does two things simultaneously. It reassures insiders. It discourages challengers. Because challenging a stable institution requires leverage. And leverage depends on vulnerability. The palace was signaling that vulnerability had been addressed. But here's the twist. In signaling stability, it also forced the final human response. Because once someone realizes the institution has moved on without them, visibly, the last illusion falls away. This is where the emotional stakes peak. The realization that there will be no reconciliation, no quiet reentry, no gradual normalization, no restoration of assumed position, just finality. And finality provokes reckoning. Inside sources describe this phase as the most volatile, not because of what happened publicly, but because of what could happen privately. This is the phase where people reassess loyalty, memory, and narrative, where they ask themselves, what story do I tell now? Because silence is no longer protective. It's isolating. And isolation can push people toward action. The palace knew this, which is why the next move wasn't reactive. It was preventative. A line was drawn not just in access, but in association. The message wasn't "you are out." It was "we are not connected." That distinction matters, because it removes the oxygen from implication. Once association is severed, claims of proximity lose credibility. That's how institutions neutralize potential escalation, by removing context. And context is what gives statements power. Now let's talk about the cost of this decision, because there is always a cost. Internally, this hardened relationships. Externally, it invited interpretation. Emotionally, it created wounds that won't heal quietly. But strategically, it achieved something essential. It closed the loop. The late-night discovery led to action. Action led to consequence. Consequence led to clarity. And clarity, while painful, is stabilizing. Now the question becomes, what remains unresolved? Because even after clarity, stories don't disappear. They transform. The focus shifts. From speculation to aftermath. From rumor to impact. And impact is where reputations are reshaped. This is where the palace had to accept something fundamental. It could no longer control the story's existence, only its boundaries. And boundaries are what monarchies understand best. Which brings us to the final movement of this chapter. The moment when the palace stopped managing uncertainty and started absorbing consequence. Not by speaking, but by standing still. letting the structure do what it's designed to do. Endure. As we move into the next section, we're going to examine the ripple effects, not just within royal circles, but across the wider ecosystem that depends on proximity to power. Because once a boundary is drawn at this level, it doesn't just affect the person on the outside. It reshapes everyone on the inside. And the most unexpected consequences were only just beginning to surface. Because when privilege is stripped quietly, the loudest reactions often come from what happens when the ripple reaches the people who never thought they were standing in the water. That's the shift we're entering now, the phase where consequence stops being theoretical and starts rearranging behavior far beyond the original circle. Because the quiet stripping of privilege didn't just end one connection. It changed the temperature of the entire room. Inside royal-adjacent spaces, the reaction wasn't immediate outrage. It was recalibration, a subtle, collective recalculation of risk. People who had built careers, relevance, or identity on proximity began asking themselves questions they'd never had to ask before. What does access really mean? Who decides when it ends? And what happens if you assume permanence where there is none? Those questions didn't stay internal for long. They showed up in behavior. Invitations were reconsidered. Associations were reweighted. Conversations that once flowed freely became cautious, transactional, clipped. That's how you know a boundary has landed. Not when someone announces it, but when everyone else adjusts around it. This is the part of the story that doesn't make headlines, but it matters more than anything else. Because institutions aren't defined by their public statements. They're defined by the behavior they produce. And the behavior produced by this decision was unmistakable. Distance. Not dramatic distance. Not confrontational distance. Strategic distance. The kind that protects reputations quietly. Now let's talk about why this matters so deeply. Royal privilege doesn't just elevate individuals. It stabilizes ecosystems, charities, foundations, media relationships, political expectations. When someone is perceived as connected to the crown, others orbit them carefully. They assume continuity. They assume insulation. Remove that assumption, and the orbit destabilizes. Suddenly, people start asking whether association is still an asset or a liability. That question alone reshapes behavior faster than any press release ever could. And that's exactly what began happening. Meetings were postponed. Plans were revisited. Projects quietly lost momentum. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of an invisible line, because invisibility is what made this line so powerful. There was no memo saying, "Do not engage." No decree announcing separation. Just absence. And absence invites interpretation. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Because ripple effects don't discriminate. They don't stop at the intended target. They spread to everyone who shares context. That includes allies who did nothing wrong, associates who assumed safety, institutions that relied on continuity. Those people weren't punished, but they were unsettled. And unsettled people talk. Not loudly, not publicly, privately. And private conversations are where narratives evolve. Inside those conversations, one theme kept emerging. This wasn't personal. It was structural. That realization cut both ways. On one hand, it reduced emotional backlash. On the other, it increased anxiety. Because if this was structural, then it wasn't about character or apology. It was about compatibility. And compatibility isn't negotiated emotionally. It's assessed coldly. This is where the decision at the top began to echo more clearly. King Charles III had done what institutions do when they reach a limit. He had formalized an informal boundary. Prince William had ensured that boundary aligned with the future, not just the present. Together, they had signaled something that went far beyond one situation. They had clarified how tolerance ends. And once tolerance ends, everyone else recalibrates their own margins. This is the part people underestimate. The monarchy doesn't just govern itself. It sets behavioral norms for those who orbit it. And those norms were rewritten in a single, quiet stroke. Now ask yourself this. If you were someone who had benefited indirectly from proximity, what would you do next? Would you defend? Would you distance? Would you wait? Most chose the safest option. They waited. Waiting doesn't attract attention. Waiting preserves flexibility. But waiting also reveals something else. Uncertainty. And uncertainty is corrosive because it undermines confidence, not just in people, but in systems. That's why this ripple phase was so delicate. The palace had closed one loop, but it had opened many others, and it couldn't afford to let those loops unravel. So another layer of strategy emerged. Not corrective, reassuring. Not through words, but through continuity. Appearances continued as planned. Engagements proceeded normally. Institutional rhythms held steady. This wasn't denial. It was demonstration. The message was simple. We are stable. We are consistent. We are not disrupted. That message was aimed less at the public and more at the ecosystem. Because ecosystems respond to cues. And stability cues calm speculation. But calm doesn't erase curiosity. It redirects it. And curiosity, redirected, becomes analysis. Observers began asking smarter questions. Not what happened, but what does this mean? That's a more dangerous question, because meaning shapes legacy. And legacy is what monarchies protect above all else. This is where the palace faced a subtle but serious challenge. How do you allow consequences to play out without allowing interpretation to harden into myth? You don't correct everything. You don't explain everything. You let time do some of the work. But time only works if nothing contradicts the message, which is why consistency became non-negotiable. No mixed signals. No partial access restored. No quiet exceptions. Consistency is boring. And boring is stabilizing. Now let's address the human side again, because it never disappears. For those on the outside of this newly drawn boundary, the ripple effects felt like isolation multiplied. Not only was the institution gone, so were many of the assumptions that came with it. Calls went unanswered. Invitations dried up. Associations cooled. This wasn't coordinated punishment. It was risk management. Others were protecting themselves. And that's where resentment can deepen. Because when people distance themselves to avoid risk, it feels like betrayal. But betrayal, in this context, isn't emotional. It's structural. No one was making a statement. They were making a calculation. And calculations don't care about feelings. This is where the story stops being about one decision and starts being about its long shadow. Because shadows reveal shape. And the shape revealed here was unmistakable. The monarchy had decided that certain forms of ambiguity were no longer tolerable. Not because they were new, but because they had persisted too long. That's the lesson echoing outward. Tolerance is not infinite. Access is not permanent. Silence is not protection. Once those truths land, behavior changes. And behavior is the true currency of power. So what does this mean moving forward? It means that the next time something questionable emerges, the response won't be slower. It will be faster. It means that internal warnings will be taken more seriously. It means that discretion will be defined more narrowly. And it means that future boundaries will be drawn earlier. That's the real legacy of this moment. Not scandal. Not drama. Clarification. Now here's the final twist of this section. While everyone else was recalibrating, one group reacted differently. Those who believed they had nothing to lose. They didn't pull back. They leaned in. They watched closely. They listened carefully. Because moments like this don't just end things. They create opportunities. Opportunities to reposition, to renegotiate, to redefine relevance. And that's where the next phase of this story begins. Because as some retreated, others advanced. Not visibly, strategically. And the palace knew that too. Which is why the next challenge wasn't about fallout. It was about opportunism. Who would try to fill the vacuum? Who would reinterpret absence as weakness? Who would attempt to test the boundary? Those questions were already being asked behind closed doors, and they demanded answers. In the next section, we're going to examine the unexpected players who began to move as the dust settled, and how their actions forced the palace to reinforce its position one final time. Because every power vacuum invites movement, and not all movement is welcome. Who moves first when power creates a vacuum? That's the question the palace began asking as the dust settled. Because silence doesn't just end stories. It creates space, and space invites movement. This is where the narrative shifts again, not because of what the palace did, but because of what others tried to do in response. Up to this point, most reactions had fallen into two categories: retreat, recalibration. People pulled back, reassessed their risk, and waited to see how firm the new boundary really was. But a smaller, far more dangerous group reacted differently. They advanced. Quietly. Strategically. Confidently. These weren't outsiders. They weren't critics. They weren't loud commentators chasing clicks. They were insiders and near insiders, people who understood how proximity to power works and believed that moments of transition are moments of opportunity. And that belief is not wrong. Every institutional reset creates openings, gaps where influence can be reasserted, alliances reshaped, and relevance renegotiated. The palace knew this, which is why the ripple phase didn't end with stability. It demanded vigilance. Because opportunism doesn't announce itself as defiance. It presents itself as helpfulness, support, availability, alignment. That's the first move. Insiders describe it as leaning in, an increase in contact, an eagerness to assist, a subtle attempt to position oneself closer to the center as others step back. On the surface, it looks harmless, but it's not, because opportunism thrives on uncertainty. And uncertainty was everywhere. Who still had influence? Who didn't? What relationships still mattered? Which channels were still open? Those questions were being asked quiet,